The Atlantic Campaign of 1806 was a complicated series of manoeuvrees and counter-manoeuvres conducted by squadrons of the French Navy and the British Royal Navy across the Atlantic Ocean during the spring and summer of 1806. As part of the Napoleonic Wars, the campaign followed directly from the Trafalgar Campaign of the year before, in which the French Mediterranean fleet had crossed the Atlantic, returned to Europe and joined with the Spanish fleet. On the 21st of October 1805, this combined force was destroyed by a British fleet under Lord Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar, although the campaign did not end until the Battle of Cape Ortegal on 4 November 1805. Believing that the French Navy would not be capable of organized resistance at sea during the winter, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Barham, withdrew the British blockade squadrons to harbour. Barham had miscalculated. The French Atlantic Fleet, based at Brest, had not been involved in the Trafalgar campaign and was therefore at full strength. Taking advantage of the reduction in the British forces off the port, Napoleon ordered 2 heavy squadrons to sea, under instructions to raid British trade routes while avoiding contact with equivalent Royal Navy forces. Departing from Brest on 13 December 1805, it was 12 days before the Admiralty in London were aware of the French movements, by which time the French squadrons were deep in the Atlantic, one under Vice Admiral Corentin Urbain Leissig's intending to cruise in the Caribbean and the other, under Contra-Admiral Jean-Baptiste Willaumez, sailing for the South Atlantic. 2 British squadrons were hastily mustered and dispatched in pursuit, one under the command of Rear Admiral Sir Richard Strachan and the other under Rear Admiral Sir John Borlase Warren. These squadrons were joined by a third under Rear Admiral Sir John Thomas Duckworth, who had deserted his station off Cadiz when he learned news of a French squadron to his south and subsequently crossed the Atlantic in pursuit of Willaumez. Although Willaumez managed to escape into the South Atlantic, Leissig's was less successful and was discovered and destroyed at the Battle of San Domingo in February 1806 by a combined force under Duckworth and Rear Admiral Alexander Cochrane. Other squadrons already at sea became embroiled in the campaign. A smaller squadron that had been raiding the African coast under Commodore Jean-Martin Adrien Lermite since August 1805 provided a diversion to the major campaign but failed to draw off significant British forces, while the remnants of a French squadron under Contra-Admiral Charles Alexander Durand Linois that had been operating in the Indian Ocean since 1803, was intercepted and defeated by Warren in March, after a chance encounter on its journey back to France. Willaumez achieved minor success in his operations in the South Atlantic and Caribbean, but was caught in a summer hurricane on his return journey and his ships were scattered along the eastern seaboard of North America. The survivors gradually returned to Brest during the autumn, the last arriving in early 1807. The campaign was the last significant operation in the Atlantic for the remainder of the war, and no French squadron of any size left any of the Biscay ports until 1808. The losses suffered by the Brest fleet weakened it so severely that it would not participate in a major operation until 1809, when an attempt to break out of Brest ended in defeat of the Battle of Basque Roads. Background: Trafalgar. On 30 March 1805, the French Mediterranean fleet under Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve successfully broke out of Toulon harbour, avoiding the British blockade fleet under Vice Admiral Lord Nelson and sailing westwards out of the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic. Nelson following several days behind. Panicked by the British arrival, Villeneuve immediately returned to Europe, with Nelson again close behind. Villeneuve's orders had specified that he sail to Brest, the French naval port on the Bay of Biscay, and join there with the fleet under Vice Admiral Honoré Ganteaume. Together this force would drive the Royal Navy out of the English Channel in preparation for an invasion of Britain. At the ensuing Battle of Cape Finisterre, Calder captured 2 Spanish ships but failed to inflict a decisive blow on Villeneuve's squadron. which later sailed to Cadiz, Spain's principal Atlantic seaport. Nelson arrived shortly afterwards and initiated a blockade of the port. Although Nelson was killed at the height of the battle, his squadron inflicted a devastating defeat on the combined fleet, capturing or destroying 17 French or Spanish ships, including Villeneuve's flagship. The battered remnants of the French Mediterranean and Spanish Atlantic fleets retreated to Cadiz, although 4 French ships fled north and were intercepted and captured at the Battle of Cape Ortegal 2 weeks later. In total, the campaign cost Napoleon 13 French and 12 Spanish ships, eliminating any possibility of even regional superiority at sea and therefore preventing the planned invasion of Britain, which had already been indefinitely postponed. The elimination of the French and Spanish fleets and the end of the threat of French invasion was widely celebrated in Britain, and seen by First Lord of the Admiralty Lord Barham as an opportunity to reduce costs and damage to his ships by withdrawing the Atlantic blockade to Britain during the winter under the assumption that the battered French navy would be unable and unwilling to operate at sea during the period. He wrote, "It is of little purpose now to wear out our ships in a fruitless blockade during the winter." French plans. Barham had seriously miscalculated the strength of the Brest fleet, which had been uninvolved in the campaign of 1805 and was therefore at full strength. He also underestimated Napoleon, who had observed that Villeneuve's brief stay in the Caribbean had acted as a major threat to British trade, delaying convoys and causing panic among the West Indian merchants. The French naval authorities were also inspired by the effect of a raiding squadron under Contra-Admiral Zachary Allemande, which had escaped from Rochefort on 17 July 1805, caused significant disruption to British trade in the Atlantic and remained at sea off the North African coast. Seeking to repeat these effects, Napoleon sent orders to the commander at Brest, Vice Admiral Honoré Ganteaume, in November 1805 for 2 strong squadrons to be prepared for service in the Atlantic. These were to leave Brest under cover of darkness on 13 December, with orders to strike deep into the Atlantic and intercept any merchant convoys that they encountered. Subsequently, the squadrons were to separate, one to the South Atlantic and the other to the Caribbean, there to cause as much disruption to British intercontinental trade as possible. The orders encouraged the admirals not to engage any Royal Navy force of equivalent size or larger and thus avoid the risk of being captured or destroyed. Ganteaume selected 11 ships of the line for the operation, including the 120-gun first-rate Imperial flagship of Vice Admiral Corentin Urbain-Lycurgues, who was to sail to the Caribbean with 4 other ships of the line, 2 frigates and a corvette. His squadron carried over 1,000 French soldiers to augment the garrison on Santo Domingo under General Jean-Louis Ferron, and was then required to spend 2 months blockading Jamaica before cruising along the American eastern seaboard to Newfoundland, returning to France when food supplies ran low. The other squadron was given to Contra-Admiral Jean-Baptiste Willaumez in Foudroyant, with orders to cruise the shipping lanes of the South Atlantic before sailing to the Leeward Islands, communicating with the French colonies of Martinique, Guadeloupe and Cayenne, and blockading Barbados. When British opposition became too strong, he was to return to the South Atlantic off St. Helena, also returning to France once food supplies ran low. His squadron consisted of 6 ships of the line, 2 frigates and 2 brigs, and included among its captains Jérôme Bonaparte, the Emperor's younger brother. Although both squadrons carried 6 months' provisions, they were expected to capture more during their voyages, and it was intended that their raiding operations should last as long as 14 months, causing severe indirect damage to the British economy by restricting the movement of trade. December 1805. On 13 December 1805, with the majority of the British blockade squadron anchored in Cawsand Bay and the remainder driven far offshore by a winter gale, the French squadron sailed from Brest into the Bay of Biscay unnoticed. Within 2 days they had passed nearly 500 nautical miles into the Atlantic Ocean and had encountered a British merchant convoy, Wilhelmès, detaching in pursuit. The convoy was sailing to Britain from Gibraltar, escorted by the 64-gun HMS Polyphemus under Captain Robert Redmill and the frigate HMS Sirius under Captain William Prowse. Heavily outnumbered, the convoy turned away and ran before the wind, Wilhelmès in close pursuit. Later in the day a second convoy appeared to the north, of 23 ships sailing from Cork to the Caribbean, escorted by the frigates HMS Arethusa under Captain Charles Brisbane, HMS Boadicea under Captain John Maitland and the brig HMS Wasp. With Wilhelmès distracted, Lysings ordered his squadron in pursuit. Wilhelmès's ships captured a number of stragglers from Redmill's convoy and managed to isolate Sirius, which only just escaped after narrowly avoiding an unequal encounter with 4 French ships of the line. With the convoy dispersed, Wilhelmès gathered his scattered forces and dispatched the frigate Volontaire to the Spanish island of Tenerife with the prizes, before turning the remainder of his squadron southwards for his designated cruising grounds. To the north, Lysings gradually approached Brisbane's convoy during the night but did not close with him until the morning of 16 December. In response, Brisbane formed his 3 warships into a line of battle, accompanied by 3 of the larger merchant ships. This force could not hope to resist Lysings's main force, but would enable the 17 other vessels to escape by blocking the French squadron's frigates from chasing them. Ignoring the escaping convoy, Lysings formed his own line of battle and continued to close with Brisbane, whose faster ships steadily pulled away from the French throughout the day. As darkness fell, Lysings abandoned the pursuit and turned to the south, and Brisbane immediately dispatched Boadicea to Brest and Wasp to the blockade squadrons along the Atlantic seaboard with urgent warnings of the French operations in the eastern Atlantic. Brisbane himself remained in distant contact with Lysings for another day before the French squadron sheered away. Brisbane continued southwards with the remainder of his convoy, seeking the British blockade squadron at Cadiz. Duckworth's cruise on 20 November 1805, the French squadron under Contre-Admiral Allemand encountered a British convoy off the Savage Islands. Allemand's squadron was on its return journey to France when he encountered the convoy, consisting of 6 merchant ships sailing from Britain to Gorée under the escort of the brig HMS Lark under Commander Frederick Langford. Langford gave orders for his convoy to scatter as the French approached, Lark turning northwards in search of Rear Admiral Sir John Thomas Duckworth and the Cadiz squadron, reaching it on 26 November. Duckworth immediately sailed in pursuit of Allemand, leaving behind only 2 frigates to watch Cadiz in his absence. Sailing south from Cadiz, Duckworth's squadron reached Madeira on 5 December, passing Tenerife 10 days later without sighting any French ships. Continuing south to the Cape Verde Islands, Duckworth reluctantly conceded that the French squadron had escaped and he retired northwards until he encountered Brisbane's reduced convoy on 23 December. Tracking the presumed course of Lysings's ships, Duckworth continued northwards on a course that would intercept the French squadron. At 6:45 on 25 December, at 30 degrees 52, N 20 degrees 16, W, 30.867 degrees north, 20.267 degrees west, 30.867, minus 20.267. Approximately 200 nautical miles northwest of the Canary Islands, lookouts in Duckworth's squadron spotted 9 sails in the distance. As Allemand's squadron was estimated to have approximately 9 ships, Duckworth initially believed that his enemy was Allemand, possibly accompanied by prizes captured on his cruise. However, as he closed with the French, it became clear that this was a different squadron altogether. In fact, his target was Manoeuvres, and despite the French admiral's efforts, Duckworth was steadily gaining on him. The ships of the line HMS Superb, HMS Spencer and HMS Agamemnon outstripping the rest of the British squadron. By 1300 on the 26th of December, the flagship Superb was just 7 nautical miles behind the rearmost French ship, with Spencer 4 nautical miles further back and Agamemnon another 5 nautical miles distant. The rest of the squadron was more than 22 nautical miles behind the leaders, almost completely out of sight, with the rearmost ship, HMS Donegal, more than 45 nautical miles behind Superb. The more compact French squadron was therefore at an advantage. The British were too dispersed to be able to bring a powerful enough force to engage the French in equal battle, and the distance between the individual British ships was too great to allow them to provide mutual support if Manoeuvres turned to face them. Therefore, to the fury of his officers, Duckworth called off the pursuit. This decision was heavily criticized, both at the time and subsequently. Historian William James commenting that, had the Superb brought to action, as in the course of a few hours she might, the sternmost French ship, the issue, in all reasonable calculation, would have been favourable to the British. Gathering his scattered squadron, Duckworth dispatched the frigate HMS Amethyst to Britain with the news of the French activity in the eastern Atlantic. His message suggesting that the French were probably destined for the Dutch East Indies. He himself turned southwest towards the Leeward Islands, where he could resupply his ships in preparation for resuming the blockade at Cadiz. On the 2nd of January 1806 he ordered HMS Powerful under Captain Robert Plampin to sail for the Indian Ocean and reinforce the British squadron there, in case Manoeuvres' squadron reached Aegean waters. British response word of the French breakout did not reach Britain until the 24th of December, when a cartel arrived from Gibraltar with the news. The report understated the size of the French forces, claiming 7 rather than 11 ships of the line had broken out, with 4 frigates. Recognizing his error in withdrawing the blockade, Barham immediately ordered 2 squadrons to prepare for sea. One under Vice Admiral Sir John Borlase Warren gathered at Spithead, including the second-rate HMS London and 6 other ships of the line. The other formed in Cawsand Bay under Rear Admiral Sir Richard Strachan and consisted of the second-rate HMS St. George and 5 other ships of the line. Both were ordered to cruise the mid-Atlantic in search of the missing French squadrons. Warren in the vicinity of Madeira and subsequently the West Indies, eventually joining with the squadrons there under Rear Admiral Alexander Cochrane and Vice Admiral James Richard Dacres. Strachan was to pass St. Helena and cruise the West African coast to the Cape of Good Hope, guarding the vital trade route in the eastern Atlantic that connected Britain with India. If he was unable to discover the French, he was instructed to attach his squadron to that under Commodore Homeriggs Popham that had been sent to invade the Dutch base at the Cape of Good Hope in the autumn of 1805.